This is from De Profundis by Oscar Wilde. Do not be afraid of the past. If people tell you it is irrevocable, do not believe them. The past, present, and future are but a single moment in the sight of God. Time and space are merely accidental conditions of thought. The imagination can transcend them.
London, 3rd of April, 1895, Old Bailey Central Criminal Court, Regina versus Queensberry.
The texts of the trials are from the book. The 3 trials of Oscar Wilde, compiled by H. Montgomery Hyde from shorthand notes of the trials. Other sources will be indicated from the start.
Not for years has the central criminal court of the Old Bailey been so densely crowded as it is today. People begged, bullied, and bribed for admission.
The opening speech for the prosecution, Sir Edward Clarke.
May it please you, my lord, gentlemen of the jury, we are here to try Lord Douglas, the 8th Marquess of Queensberry.
Will the Marquess of Queensberry please stand?
The charge made against the Marquess is that he published a false and malicious libel in regards to Mr. Oscar Wilde. The libel is published in the form of a card left by the Marquess at the club to which Mr. Oscar Wilde belonged. It was a visiting card of Lord Queensberry's with his name printed upon it.
The court accepts it as Exhibit A.
The card had written upon it,
Oscar Wilde, posing sodomite.
Now it is a matter of most serious moment that such a libel as that should in any way be connected with a gentleman who has borne such a high reputation in this country.
From the Echo!
Several hours before the day's business opened at the Old Bailey this morning, people were using every effort to gain entrance to the Old Court. Persons been disappointed to find that prominence would not serve them to gain entrance to the criminal courts.
Mr. Wilde is a famous artist, considered by many to be amongst the foremost writers of this century. He represents a form of artistic literature which recommends itself to the foremost minds and the most cultivated people. He is a poet and novelist, essayist, and playwright, and his last 4 plays have been great successes in the West End. 2 of which are currently being performed there.
From the Evening News!
The importance of being early was never better illustrated at the Old Bailey, where long before 10 o'clock, every seat where a pressman could sit had a couple of competitors for it.
The Marquess of Queensberry's claim to fame is that he patronized the man of the man's name, the Queensberry.
I object.
Sustained. Sir Edward, please.
Now, the suggestion is made that there was no guilt of the actual offense, but that in some way or other, the person of whom those words did appear, desired to appear, and posed to be a person guilty of, or inclined to the commission of the gravest of all offenses. You will appreciate that the leaving of such a card openly with the porch of a club is the most serious offense, and one likely, gravely, to affect the position of whom that injurious suggestion was made.
From Reynolds' newspaper.
The text of the words written upon the card are of such character as to be unfit for publication.
Now, the matter does not stop at the question of whether the card was delivered, whether the defendant can in any way be excused by strong feeling, mistaken feeling, for having made that statement, by the plea which he has brought before the court, in which graver issue has been raised. In his plea of justification, he states that the statement made in his card is true, and that it was made for the public benefit. Gentlemen of the jury, it is for those of you who have put into this plea these serious allegations to prove to you, if they can, by credible witnesses, that these allegations are true. Witnesses will be called who will prove the publication of the libel, and my learned friend has the task of satisfying you that there was enough justification for the publishing of that card.
John Sholto Douglas, Marquess of Queensberry, how do you plead?
I plead not
guilty, and also that the libel is true, and that it is for the public benefit that it should be published. I wrote that card to bring matters to a head, as I could not meet with Mr. Wilde otherwise, and to save my son, and I abide by what I wrote.
From the start.
This is, without a doubt, the trial of the century.
Mr. Oscar Wilde, examined by Sir Edward Clark.
I am the prosecutor in this case. I am 39 years of age. My father was Sir William Wilde, Chief Surgeon of Dublin and Chairman of the Census Commission. I was a student at Trinity College, where I took a classical scholarship and a gold medal in Greek. From there, I was a student in Magdalen College, Oxford, where I took a classical scholarship, a first in mods and a first in greats. Whilst there, I also received the Newdigate Prize for English verse. I took my degree in 1878 and came down at once. From that moment, I have devoted myself to art and literature. In 1881, I published a volume of poems and afterwards lectured in England and America. In 1884, I married Miss Constance Lloyd, and from that date until now have lived with her in Clun Street, Chelsea. We have 2 sons, the elder of whom will be 10 in June, and the second 9 in November.
Mr. Wilde, you have written several poems, short stories, fairy tales for children, and the novel The Picture of Dorian Gray.
Yes.
You've also taught in America and Ireland, lecturing on art, or more specifically, what you call the English Renaissance of art?
From a lecture to art students given in New York.
Well, I call it the English Renaissance of art because it is indeed a sort of new birth of the spirit of man, much like the great Italian Renaissance of the 15th century. It possesses a desire for a more comely way of life, a passion for physical beauty, an exclusive attention to form. It seeks new subjects for poetry, new forms of art, new intellectual and imaginative enjoyments. In art as in politics, there is but one origin to all revolutions, a desire on the part of man for a more noble form of life, for a freer mode of expression. This Renaissance will create among men a new brotherhood by furnishing a universal language.
You've also published several plays, 2 of which are currently being performed in the West End.
Yes, the importance of being earnest and an ideal husband.
When did you make the acquaintance of Lord Alfred Douglas?
In 1892, it was introduced to me by a friend.
My first meeting with Oscar Wilde was nostalgic. From the autobiography of Lord Alfred Douglas, written 30 years later.
I never heard a man speaking in such perfect sentences before, as if he had written them all overnight with labor, yet all spontaneous. He did succeed in weaving spells. It all appeared to be wisdom, and power, and beauty, and enchantment. One sat to listen to him enthralled.
From a letter written in January 1893.
My own dear boy, your sonnet is quite lovely, and 'tis a marvel that those red rose lips of yours should be no less for music of song than for madness of kisses.
From the moment we met, he made up to me in every possible way. He continually asked me to lunch or dine with him. He made much of me in every way. He bought me presents. He gave me copies of all his books with inscriptions in them.
Your slim, gilt soul walks between passion and poetry. I know Hyacinthus, whom Apollo loved so madly, was you in Greek days.
I was from the first flattered that a man as distinguished as him should pay so much attention and attach so much importance to all my wills, preferences, and whims.
Why are you alone in London, and when do you go to Salisbury? Do go there to cool your hands in the grey twilight of Gothic things, and then come here whenever you like. 'Tis a lovely place. It only lacks you. Always with undying love, yours, Oscar.
I will say of him that even if he had never written a line of poetry before in his life, he will still be the most wonderful man I had ever met.
When did the Marquess of Queensberry first object to your relationship with his son?
In April of 1894, I saw a letter he had wrote to his son.
This is the letter in question. It was written on the 1st of April, 1894, at the Carter's Hotel. It reads,
Alfred, your intimacy with this man, Wilde, it must either cease or I'll disown you. I'm not going to try and analyze your intimacy, and I make no charge. But in my mind, to pose as a thing is as bad as to be it. With my own 2 eyes, I saw you both in the most loathsome and disgusting relationship. Never in my experience have I seen such a sight as that in your horrible features. No wonder people are talking as they are. If I thought the actual thing were true and it became public property, I should be quite justified in shooting him at sight. Your disgusted, so-called father.
To Queensberry, Carter Hotel, Albemarle Street.
From a telegram written on the 2nd of April.
What a funny little man you are.
If you send any more such telegrams or come with any impertinence, I shall give you the thrashing you deserve. If I catch you with that man again, I'll cause a public scandal that you little dream of. If this acquaintance of yours does not cease, I'll carry out my threat and stop all supplies of money. So now you know what to expect.
What did you do when you learned of the Marquess's objection to your friendship with his son?
Well, I said I was perfectly ready to cease the acquaintance if it should make peace between him and his father. He preferred to do otherwise.
I treat your absurd threats with absolute indifference.
From a letter written the next day.
I have made a point of appearing with Oscar Wilde at many public restaurants, and I shall continue to go to these places whenever I like and with whom I like. And if Oscar Wilde was personally to the criminal courts for your outrageous libel, you would get 7 years penal servitude.
If I thought the actual thing were true and it became public property, I should be quite justified in shooting him at sight. Right now, I can only accuse him of posing.
If you try to assault me, I shall defend myself with a loaded revolver, which I always carry. And if I shoot you, or if he shoots you, we shall be completely justified, since we will be defending ourselves against a violent and dangerous rough. I think if you were dead, not many people would miss you.
I received your telegram by post from Carter's, and I requested them not to forward any more, but just to tear them up as I did yours, without reading it. You must be flush of money to waste it on such rubbish.
What happened next?
In June of 1894, an interview took place between Lord Queensberry and myself. He called upon me around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, not by appointment, accompanied by a gentleman with whom I was not acquainted. The interview took place in my library. He said,
"Sit down."
I said, "I do not allow anyone to speak to me like that in my house or anywhere else. I suppose you have come to apologize for the things you have said about me and that letter you wrote to your son. I should have the right any day I choose to prosecute you for writing such a letter."
That letter was privileged as it was written to my son.
How dare you say such things to him about us?
You both have been kicked out of the Savoy Hotel for disgusting conduct.
That's a lie.
You have taken furnished rooms for a new picture.
Someone has been telling you an absurd set of lies. I've never done anything of the sort.
I hear you are thoroughly well blackmailed for a disgusting letter you wrote my son.
That letter was a beautiful letter, and I never write a separate publication. I said, "Lord Queensberry, do you seriously accuse us of improper conduct?" He said,
I do not say that you are it, but you look it.
I show the court clear if I get the slightest disturbance again.
You look it and you pose as it, which is just as bad. If I catch you and my son together in a public place again, I will thrash you.
"I do not know what the Queensberry rules are, but the Oscar Wilde rules to shoot at sight. Leave my house."
I will not.
"Then I'll have you put out by the police."
It is a disgusting scandal.
"If it be so, then you are the author of it and no one else." I then went to the hall and pointed him out to my servant. "This is the Marquess of Queensberry, the most infamous brute in all of London. You are never to allow him to enter my house again."
As far as Lord Queensberry is concerned, any act he has done in any letter he has written, he withdraws nothing.
Edward Cost, attorney for the defense.
He has done all things with a premeditation and a determination, at all risks and at all hazards, to save his son.
My father's desire to save me is pure hypocrisy.
From the autobiography of Lord Alfred Douglas.
The real object was to persecute my mother and destroy me. My father is an inhumane brute, an atheist, and a lecher.
From a letter Queensberry wrote to his son.
If you are my son, it is only confirming proof how right I was to face every horror and misery I have done, rather than run the risk of bringing more creatures in the world like yourself. That was the entire and only reason of my breaking with your mother as a wife, So intensely dissatisfied was I with her as a mother to you children.
My mother divorced him. He harassed her for years and in turn neglected and ill-treated us. He is despicable and mad.
No wonder you have fallen to this horrible brute. I only feel sorry for you as a human creature.
George Bernard Shaw on the Marquess of Queensberry.
His pretended solicitude for his son and his alleged desire to save him were nothing more than a hypocritical pretense. He was a Scots Marquess, Earl, Viscount, and Baron, with a fourfold contempt for public opinion, an ungovernable temper, and after his divorce, a maniacal hatred for his family. His real objective was to ruin his son and to finally break the heart of his ex-wife.
Oscar, my entire family is with you. You must prosecute.
From Clark's unpublished memoirs of the trial.
Mr. Wilde, you have told me you are considerably in debt. Who will carry the cost of these proceedings?
My family would be all too delighted to pay for all the necessary costs. My father has been an incubus to us all. And we've often discussed the possibility of getting him into a lunatic asylum. He's a constant annoyance to my mother and everyone else. My family will be all too delighted to pay for all the necessary costs and expenses to try my father.
From De Profundis.
Of course, his family never did pay the cost of the trial.
You must all be mad! And if you make inquiries, you will find that this whole town has been reeking to the hideous scandal of Oscar Wilde for the past 3 years!
When was your next encounter with the Marquess of Queensberry?
On the opening night of my play, The Importance of Being Earnest, the Marquess of Queensberry had booked a seat for the performance.
From a letter written to Lord Alfred Douglas.
My dearest boy, yes, the Scarlet Marquis made a plot to address the audience on the opening night of my play. Henry Burke revealed it, and I had all Scotland Yard there to guard the theatre. When he arrived, accompanied by a prize fighter, the police did not allow him to enter.
The disturbance on the opening night of a new play is a most serious matter, and one likely to affect both authors and actors, and it would have been especially serious if it had become a personal attack on the private character of Mr. Wilde.
He prowled about for 3 hours and then left, chattering like some monstrous ape. He left me a grotesque bouquet of vegetables. This, of course, makes his conduct idiotic, robs him of any dignity.
The Marquess had done this in another theatre on an opening night. Not one by Mr. Wilde, but one that dealt with religious issues. At a certain moment in the play, as a character talked about religion, the Marquess got up from his seat and began shouting at the actor on stage. I implore you to imagine the consequences of such behavior on the opening night of a new play. What happened next?
On the 28th of February, I received a card from the porter at the Albemarle Club, which has been produced.
The court calls Sidney Wright.
I am the hall porter at the Albemarle Club. Mr. and Mrs. Wilde are members of the club. On the 18th of February, the Marquess of Queensberry came to the club and said,
I'm here to see Mr. Wilde.
when I informed him he was not there, the Marquess wrote on a card and said,
Give that to Mr. Wilde.
When Mr. Wilde came back to the club on the 28th of February, I handed it to him. He read it, and he appeared very distraught by its content.
Oscar Wilde, posing sodomite.
The Marquess of Queensberry has somewhat unusual spelling.
From a letter written to his friend Robert Ross that night.
Dearest Robbie, something has happened. Thosey's father left a card at my club with hideous words written on it. I can see nothing but a criminal prosecution. My whole life seems ruined by this man. I don't know what to do.
From Oscar Wilde by Frank Harris, an account of a meeting at the Café Royal.
Oscar, Bernard Shaw's lunch meeting tomorrow at the Café Royal. Come at 3 o'clock and meet us there.
George Bernard Shaw.
Wilde came in and told us the story of the conflict. He finished by stating he was taking the Marquess of Queensberry to court.
I'm bringing an action against Queensberry, Frank, for criminal libel. He is a mere wild beast.
Oscar, you must not do anything of the kind.
Now, my solicitors tell me that some of the things I have written will be brought up against me in court. Now, Frank, you know all I have written. Would you, in your position as editor of the Fortnightly, come and give evidence for me, testifying that Dorian Gray is not an immoral book?
Yes, I am perfectly willing, and I can say more than that. I can say that you are one of the very few men I have ever known whose talk and whose writing have vowed away from grossness of any sort.
Oh, Frank, would you?
He was almost in tears.
It would be most kind of you. Your evidence will win the case.
Anything I can do, Oscar, I shall do with pleasure. But I want you to consider the matter carefully. An English law court is all very well for two average men fighting an ordinary business dispute. That is what it is made for. But to judge the morality or immorality of an artist is asking the court to do what it is wholly unfit to do.
My solicitors tell me I shall win.
Solicitors live on quarrels. Let us begin by putting the law courts out of the question. If you lose and Queensberry goes free, everyone will hold that you have been guilty of nameless vice. The Crown could charge you with gross indecency and send you to 2 years hard labor. You must know that that could happen. You could go to prison for 2 years.
But Frank,
you must remember, you are a standard bearer for future generations. You are an artist and a revolutionary. If you lose, you'll make it harder for all writers in England. God knows it's hard enough already, but you will put back the hands of the clock by 50 years.
But what shall I do?
Oscar, you must go abroad. And as ace of trumps, you should take your wife with you.
You're right, of course, Frank. You know it's Bosie who wants me to prosecute his father.
Let Queensberry and his son fight up their own miserable quarrels. They are well matched.
Oh, Frank, how can I do that?
I think it was about this time that Bosie Douglas came in.
The day at the lunch at the Cafe Royale, I was anxious that the case of mine against my father would continue, and I resented any argument in its abandonment. I was afraid Oscar would weaken and throw up the sponge.
At Oscar's request, Harris repeated his argument, and to my astonishment, Douglas got up at once and said,
"Such advice shows you are no friend of Oscar."
What do you mean?
He turned and left the room on the spot. Then Oscar got up and said,
"It is not friendly of you, Frank. It really is not friendly."
And he too left the room.
I turned to Shaw and said, "Did I say anything in the heat of the argument that would have offended Oscar or Douglas?"
Nothing. Not a word. You have nothing to reproach yourself with.
I was afraid that I could not convince you and Shaw, and that you would talk Oscar out of the state of mind I had gotten him into.
You reptile!
Once Douglas left, I was suddenly struck by a sort of likeness, a similarity of expression and of temper between Lord Alfred Douglas and his unhappy father. That little face blanched with rage, those wild, hating eyes, the shrill voice too, was Queensberry's.
You were no son of mine, and I never thought you were.
One thing was clear from our meeting. Lord Alfred had set his mind on Wilde prosecuting his father, and it seemed as if he knew exactly how that was to be done.
Sir Edward, you must put me in the witness box at once so I may testify against my father.
From the autobiography of Lord Alfred Douglas.
Or else we might as well throw up this case at once.
Calm yourself. I agree with everything you are saying, but my idea of the way to conduct this case is at the very outset a deadly attack on Lord Queensberry for his conduct to his family, of which we have ample proof in his letters to you.
But you must promise me faithfully that you will put me in the box. He replied.
I promise you I will. You shall go immediately into the box after my opening speech.
From the unpublished memoirs of the trials by Sir Edward Clarke.
I made no such agreement or promise.
A warrant for the arrest of Lord Shoto Douglas, the 8th Marquess of Queensberry, was issued the next day.
In his plea of justification, submitted by the Marquess of Queensberry, he states that the statement made in his card is true, and that it was made for the public benefit. In support of this, he puts forth, amongst other things, the following proofs. First, that Mr. Wilde published, or caused to have published, a certain magazine with the title The Chameleon, that relates to persons of unnatural habit. And second, that Mr. Wilde published, or caused to have published, a certain immoral and indecent book with the title The The Picture of Dorian Gray. The Marquess alleges that this book describes the passions, intimacies, and relations of a persons guilty of or inclined to the commissions of unnatural habit. According to this plea of justification, what is on trial here is not the Marquess of Queensberry, but Mr. Wilde art. Mr. Wilde, it is suggested that you're responsible for the publication of the magazine, The Community, on the front page of which some aphorisms of yours appear. But beyond sending that contribution, had you anything to do with the preparation or publication of the magazine?
No, nothing whatever.
The other question relates to the book, The Picture of Dorian Gray. Here are some reviews of Dorian Gray. The Speaker.
A work of serious art.
The Glasgow Herald.
The book is a delight to the heart and the eye.
The Echo.
The end suffered by Dorian Gray, his disintegration into a heap of muck, is the only right punishment for a man of his nature. Mr. Wilde has written the most moral book of this century.
Mr. Wilde, would you care to add anything?
No.
And the next part of the plea of justification submitted by the Marquess of Queensberry, he names several young men and impugns your character with them. You have read the plea.
Yes.
Is there any truth in any of these accusations?
There is no truth whatever in any one of them.
Nothing more of this witness.
The cross-examination of Oscar Wilde by Mr. Edward Carson.
Lord Queensberry's conduct has been absolutely consistent all through, and yet the facts in which he states as to the acts and doings of Mr. Wilde are correct, that not only was he justified in doing everything he could to cut short what would probably prove to be the most disastrous acquaintance for his son, but in taking every step which suggests itself to him to bring about an inquiry into the acts and doings of Mr. Wilde. You stated that your age was 39. I think you are more than 40.
I have no wish to pose as being young. I am 39 or 40. You have my certificates, and that should settle the matter.
You were born on the 16th of October, 1854. That makes you more than 40.
Ah, very well.
How old is Lord Alfred Douglas?
Lord Alfred Douglas is around 24 years of age. It was between 20 and 21 when I met him.
I hold in my hand a letter written by Mr. Wilde to Lord Alfred Douglas. I will now read it for the court. My own dear boy, your sonnet was quite lovely. It is a marvel that those red rose lips of yours should be made no less for music of song than for madness of kisses. Your slim gilt soul walks between passion and poetry. I know Hyacinthus, whom Apollo loved so madly, was you in Greek days. Why are you alone in London? And when do you go to Salisbury? Do go there to cool your hands in the grey twilight of Gothic things, then came here whenever you like. It is a lovely place. It only lacks you. Always, with undying love, yours, Oscar. Why should a man of your age, just a boy nearly 20 years younger as my own boy?
I was fond of him. I've always been fond of him. Sir, that is a beautiful letter. It is a poem. You may as well cross-examine me as to whether King Lear or a sonnet of Shakespeare's is proper.
Apart from art, Mr. Wilde.
Well, I cannot answer apart from art.
Suppose a man who is not an artist had written this letter. Would you say it is a proper letter?
Oh, a man who was not an artist could not have written that letter.
Why?
Well, because nobody but an artist could write it. He certainly could not use the language if he were not a man of letters.
I can suggest, for the sake of your reputation, that there is nothing very wonderful in those red rose lips of yours.
Well, a great deal depends on the way it's read.
Your slim gilt soul walks between passion and poetry. Is that a beautiful phrase?
Well, not as you read it, Mr. Carson. You read it very badly.
I do not profess to be an artist, and when I hear you give evidence, I am glad I am not.
My lord, I do not think that my friend should speak in this way.
Sustained. Mr. Carson, please.
And pray, do not speak to my friend like that again.
Here is another letter which I also believe you wrote to Lord Alfred Douglas. Will you read it?
No, I decline. I don't see why I should.
Fine, then I will. Dearest of all boys, your letter was delightful, bread and yellow wine to me, but I am sad and out of sorts. Both, you must not make scenes. They kill, they wreck the loveliness of life. I cannot see you so Greek and gracious, distorted with passion. I cannot hear your curved lips saying hideous things to me. I would sooner die than have you bitter, unjust, hated. I must see you soon. You are the divine thing I want, the thing of grace and beauty, but I do not know how to do it. I have also got a new city. Why are you not here? My dear, my wonderful boy. Is that an ordinary letter?
Well, I was not writing an ordinary letter. Everything I write is extraordinary. Great heavens, ask me anything you like about it.
Is that the kind of letter a man writes to another?
It was a tender expression of my great admiration for Lord Alfred Douglas.
Mr. Wilde, this is the magazine The Chameleon?
Yes.
Why did you contribute your writings to The Chameleon?
Well, I was asked by a friend to do so.
Would that friend be Lord Alfred Douglas?
Yes.
Why would he ask you to contribute to this issue of the magazine?
Well, the publishers are friends of his at Oxford. The Chameleon is an Oxford undergraduate publication.
Lord Alfred Douglas also published to this issue of the magazine 2 poems, I believe.
Yes, 2 very beautiful poems.
In addition to your contribution, and the 2 poems by Lord Alfred Douglas, there is also a short story entitled The Priest and the Acolyte. In it, a priest falls in love with a boy who serves him at the altar, and then is found out by the rector in the priest's room, and then scandal arises. Have you read The Priest and the Acolyte?
Yes.
Then you have no doubt whatsoever that it is an improper story.
From a literary point of view, it is highly improper. It would be impossible for a man of literature to judge it otherwise. By literature, I mean selection of subject, treatment, and the like. I thought the subject rotten and the treatments rotten.
You are of the opinion that there is no such thing as an immoral book.
Well, that is correct.
So may I take it you think The Priest and the Acolyte was not immoral?
Well, it was worse. It was badly written.
Do you think the story blasphemous?
I thought it horrible. The end was wrong.
Answer the question, sir. Did you or did you not find the story blasphemous?
I thought it horrible. Blasphemous is not a word of mine. In writing a book or a play, I'm concerned entirely with literature. That is, with art. I aim not at doing a thing of good or of evil, but at making something that will have some quality of beauty.
This is your contribution to The Chameleon. Phrases and philosophies for the use of the young. One of those phrases, wickedness, is a myth invented by good people to account for the curious attractiveness of others. Do you think that true?
Well, I rarely think anything I write is true.
Did you say rarely?
I said rarely. I might have said never. Not true in the actual sense of the word.
If one tells the truth, one is sure sooner or later to be found out.
Now that is a pleasing paradox, and I do not set very high store on it as an axiom.
Is it good for the young?
Well, anything is good that stimulates thought in any age.
Whether moral or immoral?
There is no morality or immorality in thought, Mr. Carson.
Pleasure is the only thing one should live for.
Well, I think the realization of oneself is the prime aim in life, and to do so through pleasure is surely finer than to do so through pain. I am on that point entirely on the side of the ancients, the Greeks. It is a pagan idea.
A truth ceases to be true when more than one person believes it.
Well, perfectly. That would be my metaphysical definition of the truth. Something so personal that it could not be appreciated by 2 minds.
Then what would you say would be the effect of phrases and philosophies for the use of the young, taken in connection with such an article as The Priest and the Acolyte?
Well, undoubtedly, it was the idea that may be formed that made me object so strongly to the story. I saw at once that phrases that were perfectly paradoxical, nonsensical, or whatever you may like, may be read in conjunction with it.
I will now move on to the picture of Dorian Gray. These are other reviews of Dorian Gray, the Scottish leader.
The novel portrays the gilded paganism which has been staining these later years of Victorian epoch with horrors that carry us back to the worst incidents in the history of ancient Rome.
The St. James Gazette.
The picture of Dorian Gray is a stupid and vulgar piece of work, not wishing to offend the nostrils of decent persons. We do not propose to analyze it. Suffice it to say that it is dangerous and corrupt.
From the soul of man under socialism.
In the old days, men had the rack. Now they have the press.
This is from your introduction to Dorian Gray. There is no such thing as a moral or immoral book. Books are either well written or badly written. That expresses your view.
My view on art, yes.
Then may I take it that no matter how immoral a book may be, as long as it is well written, it is a good book.
Well, yes, if it were well written so as to produce a sense of beauty, which is the highest form of which a human being is capable. If it were poorly written, it should fill me with disgust.
A perverted novel might as well be a good book.
I don't know what you mean by a perverted novel.
Then I will suggest Dorian Gray as being up to the interpretation of such a novel.
Well, that could only be to brutes and illiterates. The views of Philistines are entirely unaccountable.
The St. James Gazette.
Mr. Wilde says the story is a moral tale because the wicked persons in it come to a bad end.
I never said my characters were wicked.
In this newspaper's opinion, the work is unredeemed because it constantly hints, not obscurely, at disgusting sins and abominable crimes.
The books that the world calls immoral are the books that show the world its own shame.
I will now read from Dorian Gray. This is from the segment when the painter Basil Hallward first meets Dorian Gray. The story was simply this. 2 months ago, I was at a crush at Lady Brandon's. Well, after being in the room about 10 minutes, talking to huge overdressed dowagers and tedious academicians, I suddenly became conscious that someone was looking at me.
I turned halfway round and saw Dorian Gray for the first time. When our eyes met, I felt a curious instinct of terror come over me. I felt myself growing pale. I knew that I had come face to face with someone whose mere personality was so fascinating that, if I allowed it to do so, would absorb my whole nature, my whole soul, my very art itself. I grew afraid and turned to quit the room. It was not courage that made me do so, it was cowardice, I'm sorry to say. I take no credit to myself for trying to escape. I struggled towards the door. There, of course, I ran into Lady Brandon. "You're not going away so soon, Mr. Hallward," she exclaimed. You know, her shrill, horrid voice. She's a peacock in everything but beauty. I could not escape her. She brought me up to the royalties and the people with stars and garters, and elderly ladies with huge tiaras and gigantic parrot noses. Suddenly, I found myself face to face with a young man whose personality had so strangely stirred.
We were quite close, almost touching. Our eyes met again, and I knew it was reckless of me, but I asked Lady Brandon to introduce us. The Pall Mall Gazette.
The picture of Dorian Gray ought to be chucked into the fire.
Well, I should say that a book such as mine ought to be chucked into the fire is silly. That's what one does with newspapers.
I see. Here is another section. I see Dorian every day. I couldn't be happy if I didn't see him every day. Of course, sometimes it is only for a few moments, but a few moments with somebody one worships is worth a great deal.
It is quite true that I have worshipped you with far more romance of feeling than a man usually gives to a friend. From the moment we met, your personality has had the most extraordinary influence on me. I knew that I had come face to face with someone that I had loved madly, extravagant, absurd. I was jealous of everyone to whom you spoke. I wanted to have you all to myself. I was only happy when I was with you. When we were apart, you were still present in my art. One day, I determined to paint a wonderful portrait of you. It was to have been my masterpiece. But as I worked, each flaking film of color seemed to reveal to me my secret.
I grew afraid that the world would know of my adultery. I felt, Dorian, that I had told too much. Then it was that I resolved to never have the picture shown. The picture must not be exhibited. You mean to say that that passage describes the natural feelings of one man towards another?
Well, it would be the influence produced by a beautiful personality.
A beautiful person?
I said a beautiful personality. You may take it as you like. Dorian Gray certainly was a most remarkable personality.
May I take it that you, as an artist, have never known the feeling that you have described?
I've never allowed any personality to dominate my art.
Then you have never had that feeling?
No.
But let's go over it phrase by phrase. I quite admit that I adored you madly. Have you ever adored a young man madly?
No, not madly. I prefer love, that is the higher form.
Never mind that, let's keep to the level we are at now.
I have never given adoration to anybody, except myself.
Well, then you have never had that feeling.
No, it is entirely borrowed from the work of Shakespeare, I'm sorry to say. Yes, from Shakespeare's sonnets.
I grew jealous of everyone to whom you spoke. Have you ever been jealous of a young man?
No.
I wanted to have you all to myself. Have you ever had that feeling?
No, I should consider it a nuisance, an intense bore.
I grew afraid that the world would know of my indulgence. Why should he be afraid that the world should know?
Because there are people in this world who cannot understand the intense admiration that an artist can feel for a beautiful personality. These are the conditions under which we live. I regret that.
These people who do not have the high understanding that you have might put it down as something wrong.
Well, undoubtedly.
Thursday, 4th of April, 1895. The second day of the trial from the Evening News.
Today is the second day of the hearing of the prosecution of the Marquess of Queensberry for criminal libel by Mr. Oscar Wilde. Fame of yesterday's report of Little House has gone abroad. Newspapers across the world have front-page stories on the trial. In Paris, Latin.
This is how the English behave as their poets.
The New York Herald.
This is how English poets behave.
Today, the cross-examination intends to leave the literary plane and attempt to penetrate the dark, dim-lit, perfume-filled rooms where the poet of the beautiful met with valets and grooms in the bond of silver cigarette cases.
My father used the time right before the second trial to hire 2 detectives to round up men who'd been with Oscar.
From the autobiography of Lord Alfred Douglas.
These men were warned that unless they testified against Oscar, they too would face criminal prosecution.
The court is in session.
Lord Queensberry learned that Oscar Wilde had been going about with young men who were not co-equal to him in social position or in age. These young men are some of the most immoral characters in all of London. I refer above all else to the man Alfred Taylor, the most notorious character, as the police will tell the court, who occupied rooms which were nothing more than a shameful den. Mr. Wilde, do you know Alfred Taylor?
Yes.
Is he an intimate friend of yours?
He is a friend of mine. I would not call him an intimate friend. I've been to his house several times, some 7 or 8 perhaps.
You used to go to tea parties, afternoon tea parties.
Yes.
Did his room strike you as being peculiar?
Well, no, except that he displayed more than usual taste.
Not the sort of street you would normally visit. You had no other friends there.
No, it was merely a bachelor's place.
Rather a rough neighborhood.
Well, that I don't know. I do know it was near the Houses of Parliament.
Taylor burned incense, I believe.
Pastilles, I think.
Incense, I suggest.
Pastilles, I should say, and those little Japanese things that run along rods.
Now, did you know that Taylor had a fancy lady's costume, a lady's dress in one of his rooms?
No.
Did you ever see him with one on?
Never. I didn't know he owned such dresses. I knew he was a man of great intellect and taste, and he was brought up in a good English school.
Now, did you know that Taylor was being watched by the police?
No.
Did you know that Taylor was notorious for introducing young men to older men?
Certainly not.
Did you get Taylor to arrange dinners at which you could meet young men?
Never.
But you dined with young men?
Often.
Did you meet Charles Parker at his house?
Yes, I met him at tea there.
Did you meet a man named Sidney Maven?
Yes.
Did you meet Fred Atkins there?
Yes.
How many men has Alfred Taylor introduced you to?
About 5.
Were these young men all about 20?
Yes, 20 or 22.
What were their occupations?
I don't know if these particular young men had occupations.
What was there in common between these young men and yourself? What attraction did they have for you?
Well, I delight in the company of youth. I like those who may be called idle or careless. I recognize no social distinctions of any sort. And to me, youth, the mere fact of youth, is so fascinating that I would sooner spend half an hour with a young man than, well, be cross-examined in court.
From Lord Alfred Douglas by H. Montgomery Hyde. In the first interview between Sir Edward Clarke and Oscar Wilde, Clarke said,
Mr. Wilde, I can only accept this brief if you assure me there is no truth in any of these accusations.
They are absolutely groundless.
Then you assure me on your honor as an English gentleman.
Yes.
The thing that Clarke overlooked is that Wilde was an Irishman.
This promise was made in the presence of Lord Alfred Douglas, who he never thought to deny it or to alert Oscar of the danger he faced if this lie was disproved in court.
Lord Alfred Douglas was asked years later if one denied his homosexuality.
Oscar was never ashamed of his homosexuality. Of course, we didn't have that word back then, but he never denied his desire for men. In fact, he gloried in it. Except for, as George Bernard Shaw points out, when legal fictions were in the need for the court of law.
Among these five, did Thiel introduce you to Charles Parker?
Yes, he was one with whom I became particularly friendly.
Where did you first meet Mr. Parker?
At Kettner's. It was Taylor's birthday, and I invited him to dinner and told him to bring any friends he made. He brought the two Parkers.
Now, did you know that Charles Parker was a valet in the other gentleman's room?
I did not know it, but if I should have, I should not have cared. I didn't give 2 pence what they were. I liked them.
Taylor accepted your invitation by inviting the valet in the room to dine with you.
Well, that would be your account, not mine.
Well, what did you have for dinner?
Oh, I don't quite remember.
Was it a good dinner?
Oh, yes, certainly.
Did you have wine?
Champagne, yes.
In a private room?
Yes.
You did the honors to the valet of the room.
I entertained Mr. Taylor and his guests.
Now, did you ever... Sorry, Court, let me think. I have to figure out how to rephrase this question. Mr. Wilde, did you ever have any actions with any of these boys? Mr. Parker?
No, none whatsoever.
Do you drink champagne yourself, sir?
Why, yes, iced champagne is a particular favorite of mine. Strongly against my doctor's orders.
Well, never mind your doctor's orders, sir.
Oh, I never do.
Well, after dinner, did you drive Charles Parker to the Savoy Hotel?
No, he never went with me to the Savoy at all.
Did any improprieties take place between you and Mr. Parker?
No, none whatsoever.
When did you first meet Fred Atkins?
In October 1892.
How old was he?
Around 20.
You dined with him?
Yes.
Did you give Atkins a silver cigarette case?
Yes.
Did you give Atkins any money?
Yes, £3.15 for his first song at the music hall stage.
Did any improprieties take place between you and Mr. Atkins?
No.
You knew a man named Ernest Scott?
Yes.
How old was he?
He was around 20 or 21.
You dined with him?
Yes.
Did you give Scarf any money?
No.
Did you give Scarf any presents?
Why, yes, a cigarette case.
When did you first meet Sidney Maver?
In September 1892.
Did you give Maver any presents?
No, I gave him a cigarette case.
When did you first meet Walter Greenville?
Oh, I don't quite remember when I met him, but I do know he was around 16 when I knew him.
What was his occupation?
Well, I believe he was a servant at a particular house on High Street.
Did you ever kiss him?
Oh no, he was a peculiarly plain boy. He was unfortunately extremely ugly. I pity him for it.
Is that a reason for why you never kissed the boy?
Oh, Mr. Carson, you are impertinently insolent.
Do you say that in support of your statement that you never kissed the boy?
No, it is a childish question.
Did you ever put that forward as a reason for why you never kissed the boy?
No, not at all.
Then why would you say that the boy was extremely ugly?
For this reason, if I were asked why I did not kiss the doormat, I should say because I do not like to kiss doormats. I don't know why I mentioned that he was ugly, except that perhaps I was stung by the insolent question you have put before me, and the way you have insulted me throughout this hearing.
Is that a reason for why you should say that the boy was ugly?
It is impossible to believe that such a thing could have happened under any circumstance.
Then why mention his ugly?
Well, I said it because...
Why?
Because I...
Why?
Because...
Why did you say that?
You sting at me and pose questions and insult me this whole time, and at times, yes, one speaks flippantly when one ought to speak more seriously. I admit that.
Then it was a flippant answer.
Oh yes, it was quite flippant.
My lord, I am finished with this witness.
No improprieties ever took place between myself and Granger. I went
My
down...
lord, I am finished with this witness.
This is the case for the prosecution.
I can't believe this!
From Oscar Wilde, a summing up by Lord Alfred Douglas.
If Sir Edward Clark would have not gone back on his solemn promise to put me in the witness box, I could have—
Lord Douglas's testimony would not have helped!
From Clark's unpublished memoirs of the trials.
Lord Queensberry's character was not on trial. It was quite irrelevant to the case. The legal matter was concerned purely and simply with whether or not the libel could be held up in a court of law.
From Oscar Wilde by Sheridan Morley.
Wilde and I decided that Douglas should not be put in the witness box. It would look quite bad to have Queensberry attacked by his own child.
If I would have been put into the witness box, I could have saved Oscar. Because in the first place, I was a first-class witness. And in the second, it would have been impossible for Cross to cross-examine me in a hostile way without exposing the hypocrisy of this case and establishing the truth.
For the rest of his life, Lord Alfred Douglas would regret not having been called to the witness box.
The case for the prosecution is closed, my lord. But I reserve myself to call any evidence or rebut anything that may be sprung on.
The opening speech for the defense, Mr. Edward Carson.
Gentlemen, from the beginning to the end, Lord Queensberry, in dealing with Mr. Oscar Wilde, has been motivated by one influence alone, that of saving his son. In my judgment, even if the case had rested on Mr. Wilde's art and literature alone, Lord Queensberry would have been absolutely justified in the course he has taken. Lord Queensberry has undertaken to prove that Mr. Wilde has been posed as guilty of certain vices. I am not here to say anything happened between Lord Alfred Douglas and Mr. Wilde. God forbid. But everything shows that the young man was in a dangerous position in which he acquiesced to the domination of Mr. Wilde, a man of great ability and attainment.
That's absurd.
From Oscar Wilde, a summing up written 40 years later.
After I had known Oscar for about 9 months, I did with him and allowed him to do with me what was done among boys at Winchester and Oxford. He treated me as a younger boy treats an elder at school, and he taught me things that were new to me.
And against that Lord Queensberry protested, and I ask you gentlemen, are you, for that protest, going to send Lord Queensberry to jail? I will now proceed to the most painful part of the case. I will introduce you to several young men who will testify under oath that Mr. Wilde committed acts of the grossest indecency with them. You will hear from Charles Parker. He will tell you that Mr. Wilde committed acts of gross indecency upon him. You will hear from Fred Allen. He too will tell you that Mr. Wilde paid him to commit these acts with him. You will hear from William Parker. You will hear from Sidney Maven. You will hear from Fred Atkins. You will hear these men testify under oath that Mr. Wilde committed acts of the grossest indecency with them. You will hear from their own lips that
Lord Alfred Douglas by H. Montgomery Hyde. At this point, Parker seemed to have left the court with his client.
Mr. Wilde, in light of all the recent evidence, I see no hope at all of winning this case or inducing a guilty verdict of a father who is endeavoring to save his son from an evil companionship. But moreover, if these men testify, the Crown could use their testimony to start a legal action against you for gross indecency. If we wish to avoid this, we must drop your charges against the Marquess at once. I advise you in your own interest to allow me to make a statement to this effect in court. If these men testify, I see your arrest as inevitable.
I agree with your advice.
If you wish it, I will keep the case going and give you time to get to Calais. There is no necessity for your presence in the courtroom.
I shall stay.
From Clark's unpublished memoirs of the trial.
I hoped and expected that he would leave, and I believe he would have no trouble doing so. The authorities were quite willing that he should go abroad.
Wilde chose to remain in court while Clark gave his statement.
the wonder was not that the rumor had reached Lord Queensberry, but that after it had been known, Wilde had been tolerated in society in London for for as long as he can.
At this point, Sir Edward Clark was seen to pluck Mr. Carson by the gown. He then interposed and asked leave of the judge to consult with his learned friend. After a few moments of whispered conversation, Mr. Carson returned to his seat.
My lord, I would now like to interpose and make a statement.
Yes, you may, Sir Edward.
I believe it must be present to your lordship's mind, those of us who represent Mr. Wilde in this case, have before us a very terrible anxiety. We can no longer conceal from ourselves that Lord Queensberry using the word policy was using a word for which there was sufficient justification. I hope your lordship will think I am taking the right course, which I do take after consulting with Mr. Wilde. I believe we can no longer resist a verdict of not guilty in this case. Not guilty having reference to the word posing. I would now like to interpose and say on behalf of Mr. Wilde that I would now ask you to withdraw from the prosecution. I see no. I hope this may make an end of the case.
I do not believe I have any right whatsoever to interfere with this application my learned friend has made. But, as far as Lord Queensberry is concerned, if there is a plea of not guilty, that would mean that the plea of justification has been proved.
Sir Edward, I understand him to assent to a verdict of not guilty, and of course, the jury will return that.
The verdict will be that the plea of justification has been proved, and that the words were published for the public benefit.
Yes, Mr. Carson.
Gentlemen of the jury, do you find the plea of justification has been proved?
Yes, we do.
And do you find the defendant not guilty?
Yes.
And that is the verdict of you all?
Yes.
And also that it was published for the public benefit?
Yes.
Of course, the cost of the defense will follow,
Yes,
and Lord Queensberry may be discharged.
he may be discharged. His court is adjourned.
From the echo!
And so a most miserable case is ended. The Marquess of Queensberry is triumphant, and Mr. Oscar Wilde is damned and done for. He may now change places with the Marquess and go into the dock himself.
Outside the court, prostitutes were dancing on the pavement, lifting up their skirts, capering joyfully at the downfall room they were guarding as a competitor of trade.
Oi! At least we'll have his haircut regular now.
What a filthy business!
Must be wrong.
I shall not be clean for weeks.
What happens now?
From the Daily Telegraph.
No sterner review could well have been made on some of the more artistic tendencies of our time than the condemnation of Oscar Wilde at the Central Criminal Court.
Within minutes of his acquittal, the Marquess of Queensberry dispatched this letter to the Crown's Director of Prosecutions.
To the Director of Public Prosecutions, dear sir, in order that there may be no miscarriage of justice, I think it my duty at once to send you a copy of the witnesses' statements and the shorthand notes of the trial.
This step placed the authorities under obligation to act at once. From the National Observer,
There is not a man or woman in the English-speaking world who is not under a debt of gratitude to the Marquess of Queensberry for destroying the high priest of the decadence. This is what art leads to.
on the same day, because of this letter, the Crown decided that a warrant for Wilde's arrest should at once be issued.
From the National Observer, there must be another trial at the Old Bailey and of the decadence, of the hideous conceptions of the meaning of art.
Oscar Wilde was charged with violation of Clause 10 of Section 2 of the Criminal Law Amendment Act, signed the 1st of January, 1885 by Queen Victoria.
Any male person who, in public or in private, commits, is party to, or procures the commission of any male person in any act of gross indecency shall be guilty of a misdemeanor.
I appeal now to the champions of individual rights.
George Bernard Shaw on the amendment.
There is no justification for that law, except the old theological one of making the secular arm the instrument of God's vengeance.
Queen Victoria.
Shall be guilty of a misdemeanor and liable, at the discretion of the court, to be imprisoned for any term Without hard labor.
When asked to sign this bill, Queen Victoria was warned by one of her advisors that,
Mom, this bill does not include similar behavior between women.
to which she responded,
Women don't do such things.
the bill was signed at once. It remained in effect until 1954.
From court, Oscar Wilde went to the Cadigan Hotel, where Lord Alfred Douglas had taken a room. There, he wrote to the Evening News explaining his spectacular withdrawal from the case.
It would have been impossible for me to have prosecuted Lord Queensberry without putting Lord Alfred Douglas in the witness box against his father. Rather than place him in so painful a position, I determined to bear upon my own shoulders whatever ignominy and shame may result from my prosecuting Lord Queensberry.
But nobody really believed this. Robert Sherrod's The Life of Oscar Wilde. At the Cadigan Hotel, Wilde was advised by everyone to go at once to Dover and catch a boat train immediately to Calais.
The authorities were quite willing that he should go abroad.
From Clark's unpublished memoirs of the trial.
As it was, the warrant was issued only after 5 p.m., giving him plenty of time to catch a boat to Calais.
From Oscar Wilde by Frank Harris.
At the Cadigan Hotel, Wilde sat as if glued to his chair and drank Hawkins seltzer steadily in almost unbroken silence.
If the country allows you to leave, I say all the better for the country.
From a letter sent to the Cadigan Hotel.
But if you take my son, I will follow you wherever you go and shoot you.
Oscar's wife, on hearing of the court's decision,
Oh, I hope Oscar goes away abroad.
I shall stay and do my sentence, whatever it may be.
He then lapsed into an action.
Oscar, I would go to the House of Lords to speak to my cousin and see if he can use his influence to stop the prosecution.
Oh, with what a crash this fell. I thought nothing of the detective of his father. I thought nothing else, and now
That was all he said.
At 6:10, 2 detectives went to the hotel. Wilde went gray in the face. Charles Richards. I went with Sergeant Allen to the Cadigan Hotel and saw the accused there. I said to Mr. Wilde, we are police officers and hold a warrant for your arrest.
where shall I be taken?
You will have to go to Scotland Yard with me and then to Bow Street.
Can I have bail?
I don't think you can. I then conveyed Mr. Wilde to Scotland Yard.
Oscar Wilde was imprisoned on the 5th of April, 1895, and the trial was set for the 26th of April, 1895.
You know, I have not much to do with distinguished people, but I got a very nice letter from Lord Claude Hamilton and a kind telegram from Mr. Charles Danby, the actor, with hearty congratulations, etc. A pile of messages wait for me at the National Observer, and various clubs have telegraphed also. Here's a message. Every man in the city is with you. Kill the bugger.
we have here with us Professor Marvin Taylor, Wilde Scholar at New York University and co-editor of the book, Reading Wilde. Mr. Taylor, tell us the thing you found most interesting about the trials.
Well, to me, the most fascinating thing about the trials is, you know, there's a real nexus of issues around the trials of Oscar Wilde, and it has to do with the role of art, with effeminacy, with homosexuality, with Irish in England, with class. So it's not just the fact that Wilde was being tried for sodomy. That's not the major point of what's going on. I truly believe that the sodomy charges are the less important. Wilde was being tried for his subversive beliefs about art, about morality, and about Victorian society. You see, Wilde is an aesthete, that is, an artist who argues strenuously for an aesthetic approach. And he bases it in Hellenism and in this long tradition of art for art's sake. His project is about art and about the power of art to transform man. Now, as long as he's able to maintain control of the discourse, he's very, successful.
And what happens in the trial?
Well, what happens in the trial is he comes head on up against legal discourse, and perhaps I should even say legal medical discourse. And he begins to lose this kind of patriarchal medical discourse that attempts to portray him as a homosexual, as opposed to someone who was attracted to other men.
I guess, so Wilde didn't consider himself as homosexual?
Well, did Wilde consider himself to be a type of person? You see, this is what I think is important about the Wilde trials too. It is after the Wilde trials that people began to consider themselves to be a specific type of person based on their attraction to someone of the same sex. You see, it created the modern homosexual as a social subject. So, whether or not Wilde considered himself to be a homosexual, there is nothing in what I know of Greek and Latin literature that says that the Greeks and the Romans considered themselves to be homosexuals. So there's really nothing that Wilde could have read that would have led him to construct his own identity as such. So it's conceivable that while Wilde loved having sex with men, and did, and promoted it through his art even, that he necessarily felt that he was what we would call a homosexual today. You see, I'm not convinced of that. It seems more complicated to me. Foucault talks about how it was impossible for men in the Victorian era to consider themselves to be gay or homosexual because that construction didn't exist.
Well, I guess that leads me to my next question. Why isn't Wilde telling the truth about his desire for men?
Well, Moises, this is the thing. Oscar's project was less about sodomy, I think, and more about beauty and about art. You see, Wilde was less interested in going up and admitting that he had had sex with other men than he was with expressing his own intellectual ideas about art and about aestheticism. Though it does look like he lied. I mean, we all have that feeling, or we're projecting. Do we want Oscar to be gay, therefore we're projecting that he's lying? You see, I don't know. But I can see it both ways. I fear that we project too much that Oscar was lying, because then you raise an ethical question.
Which is
it wrong for Wilde to go up on the stand and say that Dorian Gray was this beautiful personality? For him, Dorian Gray was this beautiful personality. That is what he was attracted to.
What do you think is the answer?
Well, am I to judge him by his own standards, or by the standards of the courtroom, or by the standards of later gay liberationists? You see, they hold him up as this model, but inevitably find him unsatisfactory because he was truly about something else. So yes, he lied, and I'm on very shaky moral ground here. Ethically, it doesn't bother me that he lied. You see, what they were trying to do, I think, was to fix homosexuality and to quell this disruption which Wilde represented. And it's a disruption of many things, of gender, of sexuality, of homosexuality, of class, and they did that very successfully. But by that point, Wilde had released these ideas into Western culture, which we all know are still there.
From Oscar Wilde's summing up by Lord Alfred Douglas.
After Oscar's arrest, immediate ruin followed. He had two plays, An Ideal Husband and The Importance of Being Earnest running in the West End. Up until 2 weeks before the trial, he was a comparatively rich man. But after his arrest, he was assailed by all his creditors in a body, while all his income was simply stopped. He was of course condemned to pay all my father's costs. The managers put a suspension on the performance of his plays, an execution was placed on his house, and all his furniture and effects were sold for a song.
By order of the sheriff, we will auction all articles of this house, 16 Chelsea, Site Street, Chelsea. The auction will begin with 5 lots, a collection of manuscripts of Oscar Wilde's poems. The original manuscript of the portrait of W.H., an autographed copy of Dorian Gray, Oscar Wilde's life-length portrait, a crayon drawing of a nude female by Whistler.
100 pounds!
It was overrun by a whole crowd of curiosos, idlers, and rumor mongers. Doors were broken open, valuables were stolen, and the whole crowd was carried on amidst the scene of chaotic disorder. Several original manuscripts mysteriously disappeared and have never since been recovered.
A draft of the play A Florentine Tragedy. Do I hear £4?
Dire poverty, in a time when money was needed for his defense. I used to visit him. Oscar was in prison in Holloway jail while he awaited his second trial. I used to visit him there every day in the ghastly ways that visits are arranged in prison. The prisoner goes into a box, much like the box in a pawn shop. There are rows and rows of these boxes, each occupied by a prisoner, and across from him the visitor.
Oscar Wilde's life-length portrait. I should like to start the bidding for this lot at £7. Do I hear £7?
There was a hallway between us and a water passed up and down between it.
£10. £11.
We had a shout to have our voices heard over the voices of the other prisoners and visitors. Nothing more deliberately cruel and malignant could be devised by human ingenuity. Poor Oscar was rather deaf. He could hardly hear what I said in this tower of Babel. I just looked at him as tears ran down his cheeks, and he looked at me.
Mr. Justice, my client has been in jail for 20 days, and the court date is not set for another 10 days. I must once again apply for bail.
There is no worse crime than that with which the prisoner has been charged. I therefore refuse bail.
Sold.
Oscar, I know I always advise you to fight my father, but I'm not impervious to reason. If Sir Edward Clark would have assured me that you were only cutting your throat and playing it in my father's hands, I would have been convinced. Oscar, I never meant for this to happen.
The real tragedies in life occur in such an inartistic manner, but they hurt us by their crude violence, their absolute incoherence, their absurd want of meaning.
On the day Oscar Wilde was arrested, 600 gentlemen left England for the continent on a night when usually 60 people traveled. Every train to Dover was crowded, and every steamer to Calais thronged with members from the aristocratic and leisured classes.
Oscar and his legal advisors urged me to go to France before the second trial. They warned me that my presence in the country could only do Oscar harm. They also advised me that if I would be called to the witness stand, I would only destroy whatever small chance Oscar had for acquittal. They also warned me that unless I left the country, Sir Edward Clark, who was defending Oscar for no charge, would throw up his defense. So I embarked for France the day before the trial, April 25th, 1895. It would be 2 years before I was to see him again.
Tuesday, 26th of April, 1895, Old Bailey Central Criminal Court, Virginia v. Wilde. The opening speech for the prosecution, Mr. Charles Gill.
May it please you, my lord, gentlemen of the jury. This case has received much attention in the press. I must beg you to dismiss from your mind anything you may have heard or read about the prisoner, and to abandon all prejudice you have toward either side, and to approach this case with absolutely clear minds, carefully and impartially. The prisoner Wilde has been charged with committing acts of gross indecency against the following male persons: Charles Parker, Frederick Atkins, Sidney Maver, and Alfred Wood.
Oscar Fingal O'Flaherty Wills Wilde. Do you plead guilty or not guilty?
I plead not guilty, my lord.
George Bernard Shaw on a plea of not guilty.
Wilde could plead not guilty with perfect sincerity and could not honestly put in any other plea. Guilty or not guilty is not a question of facts, but of morals. The prisoner who pleads not guilty is not alleging that he did this or did not do that. Rather, he is affirming that what he did does not involve any guilt on his part. A man rightly accused of homosexuality is perfectly entitled to plead not guilty in the legal sense. He might admit that he is technically guilty of a breach of local law, and his own consciousness might tell him that he is guilty of a sin against the moral law. But if he believes, as Mr. Wilde certainly did, that homosexuality is not a crime, and he is perfectly entitled to say that he is not guilty of it.
Gentlemen, the prisoner Wilde is well known as a dramatic author and generally as a literary man of unusual attainments. However, we must bear in mind the terrible risks involved with an artistic and literary phases of the day. I will now proceed to read from the transcript of the first trial of Oscar Wilde versus Marquess of Queensberry. Specifically, the cross-examination of Wilde on literature, The Chameleon, and Dorian Gray.
Mr. Justice, I do not think it fair of Mr. Gill to insist upon reading this. It is not fair to judge a man by his books.
This is examination as to character.
You may proceed.
The following is from the first transcript. Mr. Carson asked Mr. Wilde, "You are of the opinion, I believe, that there is no such thing as a moral or immoral book?" Wilde replied, "Yes." Carson, "You do not consider the effect of creating morality or immorality." Wilde, "In writing a play or a book, I am concerned entirely with literature, that is, with art."
Art is a spiritual ministry. It can raise and sanctify everything it touches, and popular disapproval must not impede its progress. Art is what makes the life of each citizen a sacrament. Art is what makes the life of the whole race immortal.
From the English Renaissance of art.
The arts are the only civilizing influence in the world, and without them people would be barbarians. An aesthetic education, which humanizes people, is far more important even for politicians than an economic education, which does the opposite.
Carson, "Is that good for the young?" Wilde, "Anything is good that stimulates thought in age."
Children should not be drilled in that calendar of infamy they call European history, but instead should learn in a workshop how arts may offer a new history of the world, of peace rather than war, of praise of God's handymanship, of new imagination and new beauty.
Carson, "Whether a book is moral or immoral, if it is well written, it is in your opinion a good book." Wilde, "Yes, if it were well written so as to produce a sense of beauty."
With the English Renaissance of art, I'd hope to create a movement that will change, as it has changed, the face of England. Over time, the manner and the forms of expression may change, but the principle remains. The object of art is to stir in us the most remote and divine chords that make music in our soul. Mankind is hungry. There is a void. We ask ourselves, what is the secret to life? The secret to life is in art.
Carson, "Whether moral or immoral." Wilde, "There is no such thing as morality or immorality in thought."
I have never come across someone in whom the moral sense was dominant, who was not cruel, vindictive, entirely log-stupid, and lacking in any sense of humanity. Moral people, as they are often termed, are simple beasts. I would sooner have 50 unnatural vices than one unnatural virtue, the real enemy of modern life, of everything that makes life lovely and joyous and colored for us, is Puritanism and the Puritan spirit. Puritanism is not a way of life, it is merely an explanation of the English middle classes.
Carson, "Let us go over it phrase by phrase. I quite admit that I adored you madly."
Whenever an artist or government of any sort attempts to dictate to the artist what he is to do, art either vanishes entirely or becomes stereotyped, or degenerates into a low and ignoble form of craft. This type of government that most suits the artist is no government at all.
Carson, "Does that phrase describe the natural feeling of one man towards another?"
Modern morality consists in accepting the standards of one's age. I consider that for any man of culture, to accept the standards of his age is the grossest immorality. It would be the influence produced by a beautiful personality.
Oscar, I have just arrived here.
Douglas writes from the Hotel des Dumont in Paris.
It is very nice here, and I can stay here as long as I like without having to pay my bill, which is nice since I am quite penniless. The proprietor asked me at once and expresses his regret and indignation at your treatment. Do keep up your spirits, my darling. I think of you each day and night and send you all of my love. Yours devotedly, Bose.
Gentlemen, I will now proceed to question the men with whom Mr. Oscar Wilde has been accused of committing acts of gross indecency with. I ask you to pay close attention to the testimony of these boys. age?
I am 21 years of age.
Do you have family in London?
I have a brother, William.
What is your business?
I have been engaged as a valet and my brother as a groom.
When did you first meet Mr. Alfred Taylor?
In the beginning of 1893, I was out of employment. One day I was with my brother at the St. James's restaurant in the bar. While there, Taylor came up and introduced himself. He was an entire stranger. He passed the compliments of the day and we got into conversation with him. He spoke about men.
In what way?
He called attention to the prostitutes who frequent Piccadilly Circus and remarked, "I can't understand sensible men wasting the money on painted trash like that. Many do though, but there are a few who know better. And you could get money in a certain way, easily enough, if you cared to." I understood what he alluded, and I made a coarse reply.
I am obliged to ask what it was you actually said.
I do not like to say.
You were less squeamish at the time, I dare say. I ask you for the words.
I said that if any old gentleman with money took a fancy to me, I was agreeable. I was agreeable. I was terribly hard up.
What did Taylor say?
Taylor asked us to visit him. He said he could introduce us to a man who was good for plenty of money. If we were interested, we were to meet him at the St. James's restaurant. We went there the next evening and were shown upstairs to a private room in which there was a table laid for four. After a while, Wilde came in and I was formally introduced. I had never seen him before, but I had heard of him. We dined about 8 o'clock. We all four sat down to dinner, Wilde sitting on my left.
Who made the fourth?
My brother, William Parker. I had promised Taylor that he should accompany me.
Was the dinner a good dinner?
Yes, the table was lighted with red shaded candles. We had plenty of champagne with the dinner, and coffee and brandy afterwards. Mr. Wilde paid for the dinner.
What happened after the dinner?
Wilde turned to me and said, "This is the boy for me. Will you go to the Savoy Hotel with me?" I consented, and he drove me in a cab to the hotel.
More drink was offered you then?
Yes, we had liquors.
Let us know what occurred there.
Mr. Wilde committed the act of sodomy upon me.
From this point on, Oscar Wilde would no longer be associated with Hellenism or aestheticism or revolutionary artistic ideas, but with homosexuality. He would become the body type of the invert, of the third sex, or whatever sociological or medical description that would be used to describe the male homosexual from that point on.
Did Wilde offer you any money?
Yes, before I left he gave me £2, telling me to call the Savoy in a week. I went there about a week later at 11 o'clock at night, and we had dinner with champagne. And when I left he gave me £3.
What happened at that occasion?
I was asked by Mr. Wilde to imagine I was a woman and that he was my lover. I used to sit on his knees, and he used to, as a man might amuse himself with a girl. Mr. Wilde insisted on his filthy make-believe being kept up.
Apart from money, did Wilde offer you any presents?
Yes, a silver cigarette case and a gold ring. I don't suppose boys are any different to girls in acquiring presents from them, who are fond of them.
The cross-examination of Charles Parker by Sir Edward Clark.
Did you state at Bow Street that you received £30 from a gentleman to not accuse him of sodomy with you?
Yes, I stated at the police court that I received £30. Part of money is extorted from a gentleman with whom I have committed acts of indecency. I met the duke.
I don't ask the name of the gentleman from whom the money was extorted. But I do ask the names of the men who got the money and gave you £30.
That would be Alfred Wood and John Allen.
When, in consequence of you receiving the £30, did this occur? How long ago?
I cannot think.
Well, you had indecent behavior with the gentleman.
Yes, but only on one occasion.
Did he go to your room?
Yes.
By your invitation?
He asked me if he could come.
But you took him home with you?
Yes.
And then Wood and Allen happened to come into the room while you were there with the gentleman?
Yes.
And then they threatened to divulge what they had seen?
Yes.
How much money did they tell you they got?
I can't remember.
Try and remember.
300 or 400 pounds?
Now, you say positively that Mr. Wilde committed sodomy with you at the Savoy.
Yes.
But you have been in the habit of accusing other gentlemen of the same offense.
Never, unless it has been done.
Well, I submit that you blackmail gentlemen.
No, sir. Wood and Allen did that.
When Taylor asked you if you ever went with gentlemen and got money for it, did you understand what he meant?
Yes.
You had heard of such things before.
Yes.
So you understood the practices you were going to enter upon.
Yes.
So you were in no way corrupted by Mr. Wilde.
No.
Nothing more this ways.
From De Profundis.
Why do they jeer at me? I never did them any harm. I never tried to be anything but kind to them.
From a letter from Penny.
Oscar, these men are being maintained at Cheswick and have been receiving £5 per week since the beginning of the prosecution. Charles Parker has even received a brand new suit of clothing at the Crown's expense.
The court calls Alfred Wood.
When did you first meet Alfred Taylor?
In January 1893.
When did you move in with him?
In January 1893, I was out of a job and I had nowhere to go.
How long did you stay there?
I lived with him for 3 weeks.
Where did you sleep?
In the same room with Taylor. There was only one bedroom.
When were you introduced to Mr. Wilde?
I went to the Cafe Royale at 9 o'clock one evening. Mr. Wilde was sitting down. He spoke to me first. He asked, "Are you Alfred Wood?" I said yes. Then he offered me something to drink, and I had some. Then he invited me to go to dinner. I went with him. We dined in a private room.
Was it a good meal?
Yes, one of the best to be got.
What wine did you have?
Champagne.
What happened next?
After dinner, I went with Mr. Wilde to 16 Kite Street.
Isn't that where he lives with his wife and 2 children?
Yes, but no one else was in the house, to my knowledge.
From an ideal husband.
People ask me, why were you so weak to yield to such temptation? Weak. I am sick of hearing the word, weak. Do they really think it is weakness that yields to temptation? I tell you, there are some temptations that it requires strength and courage to yield to stake everything on a single throw, to risk all one's life at one moment. There's no weakness in that. There's a horrible, terrible courage. I had that courage.
Mr. Wilde let himself in with a latchkey. We went up to the room where we had Hawkins' cell. There, the act of the grossest indecency occurred. Mr. Wilde used his influence to induce me to consent. He made me nearly drunk.
Did Wilde offer you any money?
Yes, at the Florence. About £3, I think it was.
Did he give you any presents?
Yes, he took me out to buy me a half dozen shirts and collars, handkerchiefs, and a silver watch and chain.
The cross-examination of Alfred Wood by Sam Clark.
Did you go to America?
Yes,
When?
in 1893,
When did you return?
the following year.
What have you done since your return from America?
Well, I have not done much.
Have you done
I
anything?
have had no regular employment.
I thought not.
I could not get anything to do.
In fact, you've had no respectable work for over 3 years.
Well, no.
Charles Parker has told me that you and a man named Allen obtained 300 or 400 pounds from blackmailing a gentleman, and that he received 30 pounds. Is that true?
I didn't get the money. It wasn't paid to me.
Well, did you receive 300 pounds for this blackmail?
I did not. Alan did.
You were a party to it.
I was there, yes.
When you say that you and Allen happened to come into the room while the gentleman was there with Parker.
I did not. Alan went in first.
But by all accounts, you and Allen received 300 pounds for this blackmail.
Yes.
How much did you get?
175 pounds.
What for?
Well, it was given to me by Alan.
Nothing more of this witness.
From De Profundis.
People thought it dreadful of me to have dined with these men, to have entertained their company. To me, they were delightfully suggestive and stimulating. It was like feasting with panthers. They were to me like the brightest of gilded snakes. Their poison was part of their perfection. I didn't know that when they were to strike at me, it would be at another's pipe and another's pay.
The court calls Fred Atkins.
How old are you?
I am 20 years old.
What is your business?
I have been a billiard marker. I have also been a bookmaker's clerk and a comedian.
What do you do?
Currently, I'm unemployed.
When were you introduced to Alfred Taylor?
I was introduced to Mr. Taylor in November 1892. Afterwards, Taylor took me to a dinner with Wilde.
When you met Mr. Wilde, did he invite you to go to Paris with him?
Yes, we were seated round the table and he put his arm around me and said he liked me. I arranged to meet him 2 days later at Victoria Station and went to Paris with him as his private secretary.
Did any indecencies happen between you and Mr. Wilde in Paris?
No. Once though, I got back to the rooms very late. Mr. Wilde was in bed. I went into his room to have myself a drink. A man of about 22 years of age was in bed with Mr. Wilde. It was Mr. Schwab. The next morning, Mr. Wilde came into my room and said, "Shall I come into bed with you?" I replied that it was time to get up. Mr. Wilde did not get into bed with me. I returned to London with Mr. Wilde, who gave me money and a silver cigarette case.
The cross-examination of Fred Atkins by Sir Edward Clark.
Did any impropriety ever take place between you and Mr. Wilde?
Never.
You say Mr. Wilde attempted to come to bed with you.
Yes.
Have you ever been engaged in the business of blackmail?
I don't remember.
Think.
I never got money in that way.
That being your answer, I'm going to take you. Do you know that name?
No.
Yes. On the 9th of June, 1891, did you obtain a large sum of money from a gentleman?
Certainly not.
I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I ask you to be careful in your reply. Have you ever been in custody or taken to Rochester Road Police Station?
No.
My lord, I wish to call Police Constable 396A.
Police Constable 396A is present.
Now, in the presence of this officer, was the statement you made at the police station true that you and the gentleman had been together?
I don't think so.
Think before you speak! It will be better for you. Now, did the landlady not actually come into the room and see you and the gentleman naked and in bed together?
I don't remember that she did.
You may as well tell us about what you know. I have your statement in my hand. Did not the landlady see you and the gentleman together?
Well, yes, she did.
You had endeavored to force money out of this gentleman.
No, I asked him for some money.
And at the police station, the gentleman refused to prosecute.
Yes.
So you were liberated.
Well, yes.
Atkins, I just asked you these very questions, and on your oath, you swore that you had never been in custody or taken to Rochester Road. How came you to tell me those lies?
I did not remember.
Well, nothing more of this witness.
From day to fund, I don't regret for a single moment having lived my life with pleasure. I did it to the full as one should do anything one does. I wanted to eat the fruits of all the trees in the garden of the world. I lived on honeycomb.
The court calls Sidney Mather.
Mr. Mather, when did you meet Mr. Wilde?
One day, Taylor said to me, "I know a man in an influential position who could make great use of you, Mather. He likes boys when they're nice and modest in appearance." It was arranged that I should dine at Kettner's restaurant the next evening. When I arrived, Mr. Taylor said, "I'm glad you've made yourself pretty. Mr. Wilde likes nice, clean boys." This was the first Wilde's name was mentioned.
What happened next?
I was shown into a private room. Mr. Wilde came in with another gentleman. I believe the other gentleman was Lord Alfred Douglas. From the autobiography of Lord Alfred Douglas.
Going up to Paris, not to see Mather at the Bow Street Police Court, who is awaiting to give evidence. Mather was a gentleman by birth and retired to the character and class as the other witnesses. He was being terrorized into making a statement by the same means as the other so-called witnesses.
I was placed next to Wilde, who used to occasionally pull my ear or chuck me under the chin, but never did anything that was actually objectionable. Wilde said to Taylor, "Our little lad has pleasing manners, we must see more of him." Wilde took my address, and soon afterwards I received a silver cigarette case with my Christian name scratched inside it. It was inscribed Sydney from O.W., October 1892.
I went up to him and shook his hand and said, Sidney, surely you're not going to give evidence against Oscar.
Soon after, I received a letter making an appointment to meet Mr. Wilde at the Albemarle Hotel. I arrived shortly after 8. We dined together, and I subsequently stayed the night.
Sidney!
Well, what can I do now? I daren't refuse to give evidence. They got a statement out of me.
Sidney, you must remember that you're a public school boy and a gentleman. Don't put yourself on a level as Parker and Atkins. If counsel asks you questions, deny the whole thing. Tell them you were frightened by the police. They can't do a thing to you.
Mr. Mava, did any misconduct happen between you and Mr. Wilde?
No. Nothing ever happened between Mr. Wilde and me.
Mr. Mava, I must repeat the question. Did any misconduct happen between you and Mr. Wilde?
No. Nothing ever happened between Mr. Wilde and me.
Counsel, of course, dropped him like a hot brick.
Nothing more with this witness.
The cross-examination of Sidney Mava by 7 o'clock.
Did any impropriety ever take place between you and Mr. Wilde?
No, never.
Did Mr. Wilde ever give you any money?
No, I was glad of Mr. Wilde's friendship.
Thank you. No more questions, my lord.
That is the case for the crown, my lord.
Second trial, 4th day, 30th of April, 1895, Old Bailey, Central Criminal Court, Regina versus Wilde. The opening speech for the defense, Sir Edmund Clark.
This trial seems to be operating as an act of indemnity for all the blackmailers in London. In testifying on behalf of the Crown, they have received immunity for past rogueries and indecencies. These men who ought to be accused, not the accusers. You must not act upon suspicion or prejudice, but upon examination of the facts. Gentlemen, and upon examination of the facts, I respectfully urge that Mr. Wilde is entitled from you a verdict of acquittal. It was Mr. Wilde's act, and Mr. Wilde's act alone, in charging Lord Queensberry with libel, which has brought the matter before the public and placed him in his present position of peril. Men who have been charged with the offences alleged against Mr. Wilde shrink from investigation. And taking the initiative of a public trial is proof of Mr. Wilde's innocence. Nor is that all. A few days before the first trial, notice was given of certain charges with the names of these young men. Mr. Wilde knew the catalogue of accusations. Gentlemen, what would you think of a man who, knowing himself to be guilty, that evidence would be forthcoming from half a dozen different places, stayed in England and insisted on bringing his case before the world? Insanity would hardly be the word for it. Mr. Wilde really had been guilty, yet faced this investigation.
The examination of Oscar Wilde by Sir Edmund Clark.
In regards to the Queensberry trial, was the evidence you gave on that occasion absolutely and in all regards true?
Entirely true evidence.
Of what these yous have said, what is true?
It is true that I've been acquainted with all of them, but nothing ever happened.
Of what Charles Parker has said, what is untrue?
But he says I went with him to the Savoy Hotel and committed an act of gross indecency with him. He never went with me to the Savoy. It is true we dined together. The rest, however, is untrue.
Alfred Wood.
He never went with me to Tite Street at all.
Fred Atkins.
Where he says he saw me in bed with Mr. Schwab. Mr. Schwab was in Paris, and he did sleep in the bed he described next to mine.
Why did you ask Sidney Mava to spend the night with you at the Albemarle?
Well, as company for me and as a compliment to himself.
From Oscar Wilde, summing up by Lord Alfred Douglas.
It would have been infinitely better if Oscar would have told the truth, for he would have been striking a blow for justice by saying what he passionately thought and truly believed.
The cross-examination of Oscar Wilde by Mr. Charles Gill.
Mr. Wilde, why did you take up with these youths?
I am a lover of youth.
Do you exalt youth as a sort of god?
I like to study the young in everything. I find youthfulness fascinating.
How old was Lord Alfred Douglas when you first met him?
Around 20 years of age.
Did he contribute some verses to the Chameleon?
Yes.
Some of them were peculiar?
Well, they were not mere commonplaces like so much that is labeled poetry.
You described them as beautiful poems.
I said something tantamount to that. They were original in theme and construction, and I admired them.
The following is from the poem called Two Loves. In it, two boys meet. One boy says to the other, I am true love. I fill the hearts of boy and girl with mutual flame. Sighing, the other says, have thy will, I am the love that dare not speak its name. Was that poem explained to you?
I think it is quite clear.
Then it is clear as to what it describes?
Yes.
Then the loves described relates to natural love and unnatural love.
No.
What is the love that dare not speak its name?
The love that dare not speak its name in this century is such a great affection of an elder for a younger man, as there was between David and Jonathan, such as Plato made the very basis of his philosophy, and such as you find in the great works of art of Michelangelo and Shakespeare. It is that deep spiritual affection that is as pure as it is perfect. It dictates and pervades great works of art, like those works of Michelangelo and Shakespeare, and my own letters such as they are. It is, in this century, misunderstood, so much misunderstood that it may be characterized as the love that dare not speak its name, and on account of it I am placed where I am now. It is beautiful, it is fine, it is the most noble form of affection. There's nothing unnatural about it. It is intellectual, and it repeatedly exists between an elder and a younger man. When the elder has intellect and the younger has all the joy, hope, and glamour of life before him. That it should be so, the world does not understand. The world mocks at it and sometimes puts one on the pillory for it.
Order! If there is the slightest manifestation of feeling, I shall have the court cleared. Complete silence must be preserved.
With regards to your friendship with the men who have testified against you, may I take it that it was, as you described, Mr. Wilde, the deep affection of an elder man for a younger?
Certainly not. One only feels that once in one's life and once towards any.
From the autobiography of Lord Alfred Douglas.
I'm proud to say that I was loved by such a great poet. There will always be 1,000 Queensberry for every one Oscar Wilde.
Nothing more with this witness.
Gentlemen of the jury, I understand that you have been unable to reach a verdict.
That is so, my lord. We cannot agree.
Is there any possibility that if you were to retire to your chambers for a while longer that you would be able to reach a verdict?
I put that also to my fellow jurymen. We have considered the question for 3 hours and we cannot agree.
That being so, I do not feel justified in detaining you here any longer. The prisoner will remain in prison until further notice. I will see counsel in my chambers to set a court date for the next trial. This court is adjourned.
Sir Edward Clark applied for bail and was refused by the trial judge. Oscar Wilde was imprisoned again. 4 days later, Clark applied again, and bail was set at the extraordinary sum of £5,000 from Oscar Wilde by Sheridan Morley. Oscar Wilde went to the Midnight Hotel and dinner was ordered. No sooner did he sit down than the hotel manager came in and said,
You are Oscar Wilde.
Yes.
You must leave this hotel at once.
From there he went to another hotel on the outskirts of London. He sank down exhausted on the bed. The landlord came in and said,
Sir, I am sorry, but you have been followed by a band of prize fighters. They say they will sack the house and raise the street if you stay here a moment longer. I must insist that you leave.
Finally, at midnight, he arrived at his mother's house in Oakley Street.
Let me in, Willie. I shall lie on the floor, or I shall die in the street.
Come in.
His brother grew.
At least, thank God, my vices are decent.
Frank Harris came to see him the following morning.
I'm Grave public disgrace is in store for me. I feel certain of it. I've never known terror before today, or I know it now. It is as if a hand of ice were placed on one's heart. It is as if one's heart were beating itself into death in some empty hollow.
Oscar, I have a yacht waiting to take you to France. You must go.
I can't, Frank, I can't.
Listen, Oscar, I will not cross my arms and let that band of crooks get the best of you.
Oh, Frank, you speak with passion and conviction, as if I were innocent.
But you are innocent, aren't you?
No, Frank. I thought you knew that all along.
No, I did not. No, I did not believe the accusation. I did not believe it for a moment. I thought that man mistook the artistic nature with that vice.
What you call vice, Frank, is not vice. It is good to me. I suppose this will make a great deal of difference to you.
No. Curiously enough, it has made no difference to me at all. I do not know why. I suppose I have more sympathy than morality in me. It has surprised me, dumbfounded me. It has always seemed fantastic and incredible to me, and now you make it exist for me. But this has no effect on our friendship, none at all upon my resolve to help you.
You've been a good friend to me, Frank. A thoroughly good friend.
I don't know I have been able to do much for you. In fact, I have been able to do nothing for you as I can see. I am thoroughly disappointed with myself.
You have enabled me to tell the truth. That is something. To tell the truth is a terrible thing. To be forced to tell lies is much worse.
Well, yes, but now I must take you away immediately.
Impossible, Frank, quite impossible. I should be arrested before I left London and paraded through the streets. They would shout at me and boo at me. It is quite impossible.
Nonsense. I believe the authorities would be only too glad if you went.
And what of the people who have stood bail for me? They would stand to lose their thousands.
I shan't let them lose. I'm quite willing to take half on my shoulders at once. And you can pay the other 1,000 or so within a very short time. I write in a couple of plays. American papers would be only too glad to pay you for an interview. The story of your escape would be worth £1,000. Leave everything to me.
Wilde's family had other opinions. His brother,
You are an Irishman. You must stay and face the music.
his mother.
No matter what happens, if you stay, you will always be my son. If you leave, I will never talk to you again.
His wife.
You must go, Oscar.
A letter from Wilde to Bosie on the evening of his third trial.
Dearest boy, I have decided this is a more beautiful, more nobler thing for me to stay. I do not wish to be called a coward or deserter. False name, a disguise, a hunted life. All this is not for me. Oh, dearest boy, sweetest of all among young men, most loved and most lovable. In all the worlds of pain and pleasure, you are my ideal of admiration and joy.
From the autobiography of Lord Alfred Douglas.
I do not like to think about it, but I've thought since 100 times that to go would have been a braver thing, and that to stay was an insane thing to do.
An official announcement. The next trial will not be led by Mr. Hill. The Crown names Frank Lockwood, the Solicitor General, as the prosecution attorney.
From a letter written by Douglas to the French magazine Le Coeur de France.
The third trial is a result of political intrigue. The government does not wish for the trial against Oscar to take its regular course.
From Oscar Wilde by H. Montgomery Hyde. Carson, who had been the Crown's prosecutor against Wilde, now went to Lockwood and said,
Cannot you let up on the fellow now, Frank? The jury was deadlocked.
I would, but we cannot, we dare not. It would have once been said in both England and abroad that owing to the nature of this case, we are forced to abandon it.
The government is intimidated. The fact is that the Liberal Party presently contains a large number of men with the same inclination as Wilde does. They are talking about them, and to hush up these rumors, he must be found guilty.
Wilde has already suffered a great deal. In addition, he has already spent about a month in prison, without bail, just awaiting a trial.
I would like to ask the Home Secretary this. Is it not true that you were threatened by the Prime Minister that unless a trial was substituted against Oscar and a verdict of guilty found, that the Liberal Party would be removed from power.
I can't, Edward. It would be a sign of weakness. Besides, many people in this government are said to be implicated in similar affairs. It would be said at once that it was because of them that we are forced to abandon the case. We must go on till the end.
It is a degrading coup d'etat, the sacrifice of a great poet to save a disgraced band of politicians.
The Mercure de France refused to publish Douglas's letter.
The third trial, Old Bailey Central Criminal Court, Regina versus Wilde.
I am bound to assume that as your entirely fresh jury, you are totally ignorant of all the facts which have been elucidated in the previous trial. Therefore, it will be necessary to go through the entire case again in detail. The defendant has been accused with committing offenses under Section 2 of the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885, gross indecency with male persons. He has repeatedly used his influence to corrupt young men of quite inferior station. He has pulled these men into the most vicious and depraved conduct.
From De Profundis.
I remember, as I was sitting at the dock of my last trial, listening to Lockwood's appalling denunciation of me, like a thing out of Tacitus, like a passage in Dante, being sickened with horror at what I heard.
That Wilde has been at the center of a circle of hideous corruption among young men, it is impossible to doubt.
I am Charles Parker. I'm 21 years of age. Mr. Wilde committed sodomy.
I must say to myself that I ruined myself, that nobody, great or small, can be ruined except by their own hand. This pitiless indictment I bring against myself without pity. I allowed myself to be lured into long spells of senseless and sensual ease.
My name is Alfred Wood. I am 22 years old.
I surrounded myself with the smaller natures and the meaner minds. I became the spendthrift of my genius. I grew careless with the lives of others. I took pleasure where it pleased me and passed on.
I am Fred Atkins. I am 20 years old, 3 times Mr. Wilde.
I forgot that every action of the common day makes or unmakes character, that therefore what one does in the secret chamber, one must someday cry aloud from the housetops.
The Crown will now present witnesses that will on oath state.
I am the brother of Charles Parker. Once I saw my brother accept a preserved cherry from Wilde's own.
Tis myself I blame. As I sit here a ruined man, I can only blame myself.
I am the landlady. The room was never cleaned, the windows never opened, and light never admitted.
There's nothing wrong in what I did, but there is something wrong in what I became.
I am a hall porter at a private hotel at 10 St. James's Place. A number of young men of quite inferior station.
Oh, how weary I am of the whole thing. The shame, and the struggling, and the hatred. To see these men come into the box to bear witness against me makes me sick.
I am a silversmith. I supplied Mr. Wilde with silver cigarette case.
Reason does not help me. It tells me that the law under which I'm being judged is a wrong and unfair law, and the system under which I'm suffering, a wrong and unjust system.
Oh, I am the housekeeper. After Mr. Wilde visited, the sheets were stained in a peculiar way.
The world is growing more tolerant. One day you will be ashamed of your treatment of me.
I am a professor of massage. Once I saw a young man in bed with Mr. Wilde. I never attended Mr. Wilde again.
I feel inclined to stretch out my hands and say to them, do with me what you will. In God's name, only do it quickly. Can you not say I'm worn out? If hatred gives you pleasure, indulge it.
When did you first make acquaintance with Lord Alfred Douglas?
In 1892.
When did the Marquess of Queensberry first object?
In April 1894.
Where is Lord Alfred Douglas now?
He is abroad.
Where?
In Paris. The Hotel des Dumont.
Of course you have been in communication with him.
Certainly. These charges are founded on sand. Our friendship is built on a rock. I've had no reason to cease the acquaintance.
This is from the now notorious prose poem you wrote to Lord Alfred Douglas. My own dear boy, your sonnet is quite lovely. Why did you address him as my own dear boy?
My dearest boy.
A letter from Wilde to Lord Alfred Douglas on the final night of the trials from Holloway Prison.
This is to assure you of my immortal, my eternal love for you. Tomorrow all will be over.
If prison and dishonor be my destiny, I think that this love for you and this idea, this still most divine belief that you will love me in return, will sustain me in my unhappiness, and will make me capable, I hope, bearing my grief most patiently.
Since the hope, nay rather the certainty, of meeting you again in some world, is the goal and encouragement of this my present life, I must therefore continue to live in this world because of it.
Was it a decent way to address a young man?
So happy you've gone away. I know what that must have cost you, but it would have been agony for me to have known you were in England when your name was mentioned in court.
Were you speaking of love between men?
I hope you've copies of all my books. I mind it so. Oh, that I may live to touch your hands and your hair. I feel your love will watch over my life. Try to let me hear from you soon.
Was it sensual love?
I'm writing you this letter in the midst of great suffering. This long day in court is exhausting. Dearest boy, sweetest of all young men, most loved and most lovable. Wait for me.
Wait for me. I am still yours as ever since the day we met with an immortal love.
Oscar.
What was the charge which Lord Queensberry made against you?
Posing sodomite!
Gentlemen of the jury, this case has been a most difficult one, and my task very severe.
I would rather try the most shocking murder case that has ever fallen to my lot than try to be engaged in a case of this description.
It is a case which requires the cold, calm, resolute administration of justice.
Oscar Wilde is an artist who expressed considerable influence over young men.
He has used his art to subvert morality.
And to encourage unnatural vice.
I was a man who stood in symbolic relation to the art and culture of my own age. Few men have attained such a position and have it so acknowledged in their lifetime. I had genius, distinguished social name, high social position, brilliancy, intellectual daring. I made art a philosophy and philosophy an art. I changed the minds of men and the colors of things. There's nothing I said or did that did not make people wonder. Everything I touched, I made beautiful in a new mode of beauty. I treated art as the supreme reality and life as a mere mode of fiction. I unlocked the imagination of my century so that it developed myth and legend around me. I summed up all systems in a phrase and all existence in an epigram.
Gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict?
Yes, we have.
Do you find the prisoner at the bar guilty or not guilty of acts of gross indecency?
We find him guilty, my lord.
Oscar Wilde, the crime with which you have been convicted is so bad that one has to put a firm restraint on oneself to prevent oneself from describing, in terms I would rather not use, the sentiments which must rise to the breast of every man of honor who has heard the details of these terrible 3 trials. It is no use for me to address you. People who can do such things have no sense of shame, and one cannot hope to produce any effect upon them. This is the worst case I've ever tried. Under such circumstances, I must be expected to pass the severest sentence allowed by law, which, in my opinion, is totally inadequate for a case such as this. The sentence of the court is that you be imprisoned and kept to hard labor for 2 years.
His lordship made no reply beyond a wave of a hand to the warders, who then escorted the prisoner out of sight.
The jury is dismissed. This court is adjourned.
The press lived up to Wilde's expectation by almost universally praising the verdict. The Daily Telegraph.
Open the windows. Let's in the fresh air.
The News of the World.
The aesthetic cult is over.
The St. James Gazette.
A dash of wholesome bigotry is better than over-toleration.
Oscar was in prison 2 years later. During this time, his wife changed her name and the name of their 2 children. While in prison, Oscar fell and injured his ear. This injury was to deteriorate and be the cause of his death 3 years later. While there, Oscar blamed Lord Alfred Douglas for his downfall and wrote the poem, The Ballad of Red in Jail, which contains the line, "For each man kills the thing he loves." Lord Alfred Douglas asked him what he meant, and Oscar said, "You ought to know."
After his release from prison, Wilde and Douglas lived together on and off until Wilde's death in 1900.
After Wilde's death, Lord Alfred Douglas married and had 2 children. He became a Catholic and eventually a Nazi sympathizer.
The Marquess of Queensberry died in 1899, a pathetic victim of persecution mania, convinced to the last he was being carried to the tomb by Oscar Wilde, as he used to describe his imaginary tormentors.
Oscar Wilde was buried at Bagneux Cemetery on the 3rd of December, 1900. Lord Alfred Douglas was one of the 12 people who attended the burial.
By the year 1920, Oscar Wilde would be, after Shakespeare, the most widely read English author in Europe. This is from a prose poem written a year after Oscar Wilde's release from prison. It's called The House of Judgment.
And there was silence in the house of judgment. And the man came naked before God. And God opened the book of the life of the man. And God said to the man,
Thy life hath been evil, and thou hast shown cruelty to those who were in need of succor. And to those who lacked help, thou hast been bitter and hard of heart.
And to those who cry out, thou dost not hearken, and thine ears were closed to the cry of thy afflicted.
and the man made answer and said,
Even so did I.
And again God opened the book of the life of the man. And God said to the man,
Thou didst eateth of the thing that may not be eaten. Thine idols were neither of gold or silver that in turn, but flesh that dieth.
Thou didst stain the hair with perfumes, and put pomegranates in the hands.
Thou didst stain their feet with saffron, and spread carpets before them.
And the man made answer and said,
Even so did I.
And the third time God opened the book of the life of the man. God said to the man,
Evil hath been thy life, and with evil didst thou requite good, and with wrongdoing kindness.
Those who came seeking water went away thirsty.
And to those who will never give thy love, got lust in thine turn.
And the man made answer and said,
Even so did I.
And God closed the book of the life of the man, and said,
Surely I will send thee unto hell, even unto hell will I send thee.
And the man cried out.
Thou canst not.
God said to the man,
For where can I not send thee to hell? And for what reason?
Because in hell have I always lived.
answered the man. And there was silence in the house of judgment. And after a space God spake, and said to the man,
Then surely I will send thee unto heaven. Even unto heaven will I send thee.
And the man cried out.
Thou canst not.
God said to the man,
Why can I not send thee unto heaven? And for what reason?
Because never and in no place have I been able to imagine it.
answered the man. And there was silence in the house of judgment.